failure of leadership in an American president, whereas the people of the United States, having before them the history of their nation, have divested themselves of prejudice insofar as the frailties of human nature will permit, and whereas the people have endeavored to faithfully and conscientiously discharge their civic duty by electing representatives to serve in their best interests, and whereas the formation of public opinion based upon facts and verifiable information is a fundamental responsibility of a free people, and whereas in exercising their constitutional right to choose representatives, the people necessarily bear the responsibility to justly and prudently execute the power vested in them, and whereas the President of the United States of America serves as the Chief Executive Officer of a federal constitutional representative democracy elected by the people, and whereas the Constitution of the United States is the foundation from which all governmental power and authority are derived, and whereas the consent of the governed, expressed through the vote of the people, devolves authority upon the federal government and enables the lawful execution of the powers of the executive branch, and whereas the people are not obligated to defend a president whose governance no longer serves the citizenry and instead treats the people as subjects under an unaccountable and opaque authority, and whereas the right to resist tyranny within the executive branch arises from the natural and necessary defense of human liberty, yet the constitutional authority to remove a president from office rests with the elected representatives of the people, and whereas the people are fully aware that the president's policies have increased the cost of living, rendered housing unaffordable, and worsened the immigration process, thereby fostering widespread distrust and dissatisfaction among the American people, and whereas the people have grown weary of the President's disregard for the solemn responsibilities entrusted to him by the Constitution, and whereas decisions undertaken without adequate policy-based research have resulted in widespread public disapproval and diminished confidence in executive leadership, and whereas the people are embarrassed by the President's sexist, vile, and inhumane conduct, particularly toward immigrants, and whereas the people have determined that the President's character and conduct have contributed to unnecessary suffering and unjust loss of life, and whereas the President has issued directives to appoint individuals lacking requisite qualifications to cabinet positions, has selected cabinet members based on loyalty and transactional advantage rather than competence, has divided the nation rather than unified it, has failed to support international allies, and has thereby empowered competing global powers to exploit these deficiencies, and whereas the people recognize persistent efforts by the President to distort or rewrite historical facts in order to obscure falsehoods concerning economic hardship, failures in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the events of January 6, 2021, and whereas the President has exacerbated national divisions by labeling citizens as terrorists through executive action, thereby diminishing civil liberties and constitutional protections, and whereas a federal officer who needlessly took the life of a citizen of the United States was afforded absolute immunity through executive action, reflecting a system of accountability answerable only to itself, and whereas the President has publicly characterized judicial oversight as partisan activism, undermining respect for the rule of law, and whereas the President has violated established federal guardrails to intimidate and terrorize communities opposed to him politically, and whereas the President has demonstrated contempt for the expressed will of the states and their residents, and whereas the people are deeply offended by the President's exploitation of religious extremism, xenophobia, racism, and misogyny, and by the elevation of such movements to positions of power where abuse and misconduct flourish, and whereas the people are disturbed by mounting evidence of criminal involvement in the Epstein scandal, expressions of racial animus, and acts of vindictiveness undertaken to conceal an inability to govern effectively, and Whereas the people reject false claims of economic improvement when, in reality, executive policies have produced an affordability crisis affecting families nationwide, and whereas the President has failed to reduce costs for working families, has contributed to rising prices for groceries and housing, has made home ownership increasingly unattainable, and has weakened domestic economic and manufacturing potential, and whereas the people will not accept conduct by any member of the executive branch that disregards the extensive loss of human life during the COVID-19 pandemic, and whereas the people of the United States witnessed the breakdown of the peaceful transfer of power through violent criminal acts committed against officers sworn to defend the United States Capitol, and whereas the President sought to conceal those crimes, attempted to alter historical truth, pardoned individuals responsible for the violence of January 6, and fostered a climate of fear and civil discord, and whereas the people understand that these policies and actions are fundamentally harmful, divisive, and devoid of basic human empathy and decency, and whereas the people reject cruel and unnecessary immigration policies that treat immigrants inhumanely, revoke legally obtained work permits, promote racial profiling at job sites, and target individuals attempting to earn a living within a broken immigration system, and whereas the people will no longer tolerate actions that inflict lasting damage upon democratic institutions, misuse federal officers, implement policing practices rooted in hate or systemic misconduct, or glorify authoritarian rule, and whereas the people ask forgiveness of the international community for permitting the nation to be manipulated by an individual who has demonstrated a lack of moral character, integrity, empathy, and respect for democratic norms, and whereas the people express shame that voices of decency were silenced, resulting in the projection of a national character embodied by leadership that is destructive, dishonest, and corrosive to democratic values and social cohesion, and whereas the people reject the vindictive and childish conduct of a president who deliberately employs fear and disinformation as political tools to divide the nation, and whereas the people will not accept governance propped up by sycophancy that discourages evidence-based policymaking, diminishes the nation's global standing, and transforms public office into a transactional system for personal benefit, and whereas the people will not stand for the continued erosion of constitutional and individual rights, and whereas the President in matters of domestic security and foreign affairs has assumed authority not granted by Congress or by law, but in derogation of both, and whereas the citizens of the United States call for an end to the systematic undermining of democratic processes and for a return to constitutional governance, therefore be it resolved that we, the 104th Illinois General Assembly, respectfully request that the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate immediately initiate impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States, as his conduct has risen to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, and be it further resolved that the President be afforded due process of law, including the right to a respectful defense with counsel and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and be it further resolved that upon conviction by the Senate, the President shall be removed from office without delay.